Jane Green, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
On Calling Peston. Have you listened to the previous episodes?
I listened to a little bit.
Did you like it?
Yes.
Who did you like more, me or Dan?
Well, let's not put on the spot.
Start with the biggest question of all.
No comment.
Yeah, good.
Good answer.
Correct answer. Before we get going,
Alex,
I've told that you have a book out.
I do.
Like 2 days after the election.
Oh, yes. It's
Called
actually the day after the election.
Okay, and what's it called?
It is called Electoral Shocks, Understanding the Volatile Voter in a Turbulent World.
And so you're basically praying it's a shock election.
No.
To help.
No.
Or not.
So what's important about the book is that it helps us understand why this election is difficult to judge, it's difficult to predict, it's difficult to call because of the kind of very long-term trend that we see in volatility. So we've got this much more movable electorate now, and we go into lots of detail about why that's come about. But also we're in the middle of a shock. So this election is being fought in the middle of a major change, i.e. we're leaving the European Union, or we think we're leaving the European Union, off the back of the EU referendum, which also was a major change, and these major shocks, what they do is they make different issues more important to voters, to parties, they create opportunities for parties to constantly compete around them. And what that does, of course, it means that we've not kind of got that kind of final picture of what voters are choosing between. Because essentially you've got an unclear picture from Labour, very recent commitment from the Lib Dems to revoke Article 50. You've got different, Nigel Farage still deciding what kind of campaign he's going to fight, whether he's going to challenge the deal, how he's going to challenge the deal, whether he's going to challenge all the constituencies. So essentially we're in this middle of this very kind of turbulent time in a very volatile electorate, and the combination of that means that we can sort of assess the election off the back of like, well, why is it that it's hard to understand? Why is it once we get the electoral result that voters have then, how did they then choose based on this kind of really extraordinary environment? So the book's still relevant, even though it comes out a day later.
The book.
You mentioned the Brexit result just then. Every single time I put any sort of opinion poll on Twitter, the response is always, well, they got it wrong during Brexit, they got it wrong during the 2017 election. Can we trust the opinion polls that we're seeing now, given that people are so adamant that they've been wrong for the last few years?
Yeah, it's such a good question because actually the opinion polls have not done a bad job. And so if you look over time, historically, the opinion polls aren't doing worse at predicting elections. They're not predicting elections, they're taking snapshots of public opinion before an election. And so the opinion polls haven't been getting worse. The election where there was an issue was in 2015. And the pollsters really adapted a lot of their methods and their sampling and weighting techniques and so on.
Well, how did they get it wrong in 2015, just to remind us?
So one of the problems in the big problem in 2015 is the Conservatives won a majority and the expectation was that they wouldn't and that it would be a hung parliament with Labour as the largest party. And so the polls weren't just kind of wrong in terms of the margin, they were wrong in terms of who was going to be the winning party, and so there was a shock result, a different kind of a shock. And after that, the lesson that we took from that, using a lot of the British election study analysis and data, was that the problem with the polls is it was a representativeness problem. It wasn't all of the other kinds of problems that people think is inherent in kind of, trying to take the temperature of public opinion. Actually, the EU referendum polls weren't that wrong. I mean, if you look at the polls, they were showing this kind of movement towards leave. They were showing a lead for leave most of the time, and in 2017 too, they weren't wildly wrong. They weren't wrong in the US, where they predicted that Hillary Clinton would do better than Donald Trump in the national vote. It was the Electoral College where things were harder. And so, and the polls are doing a good job in a very difficult time. I think what we can't do is expect every single poll to be completely perfect, because they've all got an error margin. That's what it is. That's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, so can you explain to us how polls actually work? Because this is something else I get on Twitter all the time, is I'll tweet a poll out and the response will be, this can't mean anything, there's only 2,000 people that have responded, we've got 40 million people who can vote. Can you just give us an explanation of why they do actually work and the work that goes into them?
So what they're doing is they're taking a snapshot, they're taking a sample. So if you have the entire population of the British electorate, what you want to do is get a representative sample of that entire electorate, because you can't go and interview everybody. There aren't methods to do that. We don't all want to answer polls. And so what they do, they try to take a representative sample and then they apply weighting. So if some of the people in the sample are from a group, there's not as many many younger men, for example, taking part in that poll, they'll say the younger men that did take part in that poll will upweight their answers. And so using targets of what we know the population is exactly like on lots of different criteria, weights are applied to make that poll as representative as it can be in the first place, and then to weight it to make it representative of the population. And so what you're trying to do is essentially mirror the wider population, bearing in mind that there's some error around it, but that's a reasonable amount of statistical error.
That's fascinating.
And on that, just very briefly on polls before we move on, you see some polls where they are predicting specific seats. I saw one yesterday, I think, in I can't remember the seat exactly what it was, but they were saying in this seat it's the Tories are up 20% or Labour down to whatever. Yeah. Would that have been a poll would they have gone to that specific place and targeted it, or would they have taken the national projection and said, right, on this projection, this is how it will unfold?
So there's two different things going on at the moment. Three different things going on at the moment. So one is, the poll, which is a nationally representative poll of the country as a whole. The other is a modelling technique, whereas essentially what you're doing is imputing demographics about constituencies. So we know various things. We know the spread of constituencies using data such as census data. We know the broad spread of how the demographics vary across constituencies. We're going to use that data to essentially predict what that, because we know the constituency characteristics on those criteria, we're going to predict how that constituency would behave in this big model. So that's something called MRP modelling, which is multi-level something or other. Post-stratification.
Well done. I can't immediately forgotten what it is.
MRP. But there's another method that's also being used, which Lord Ashcroft did a lot of in recent elections, which is to try to go into one constituency and then get a sample of just people in that constituency. And I've seen polls recently that have maybe 400 people in them, which is a small sample for, trying to take a snapshot. And then there's also, that's tricky to, some of the methodology that's being used is a little bit harder. And also we don't have all of the weighting targets for trying to get constituency samples. Now, having said that, some of the constituency polls that are being done at the moment are lining up quite closely to some of the MRP modelling.
Yeah, okay.
And so, but I think with all of these things, the most important thing to remember is in any election, is to look at the trend rather than as a kind of like one estimate. So rather than like, right, there's a pinpoint estimate, we're going to just take that and we're going to draw loads from it. Look at the trend. So are all the polls, and there's lots of polls, lots of different polling companies that are just using very, very slightly different methodologies and weights and so on. But are all the polls moving in the same direction? And I think when you see that kind of movement, they're all showing. So in 2017, what we saw was Theresa May's ratings were going down, Jeremy Corbyn's ratings were going up, the Labour Party was doing better in the election. All the polls were showing that. And I think that's much more reliable. That's the kind of, and if you think about like what we do in terms of social science, you're thinking about kind of cross-validation. Like actually, there's a pattern here, and there's more evidence, and it's all kind of pointing in the same direction, and there's movement. And we saw that too in the 2016 EU referendum, that the polls were all kind of, coalescing on this increase towards leave. And so it was very obvious that there was really something going on there. And we found in our analysis of the 2017 election that indeed, it was very important for Jeremy Corbyn because his ratings were going up, the Labour Party was doing better, and what was happening was people that had become undecided after the 2015 election were starting to make up their minds going back to Labour. So that was a shift that you saw because you were looking at across the polls on average, on the aggregate, rather than just kind of taking one poll and reading too much into it.
What's new about this election, of course, and is the fact that we have the Brexit Party. They're in all the polls because they weren't around before. I think one of the questions we get asked the most, and the thing that as journalists we're focusing on, because it's the kind of the new thing in this election, is what will the Brexit Party do by way of impact on this election? Yeah. Will they take votes from the Tories? Will they take votes from Labour? Yeah. Will they actually have an impact at all? What is the data saying? What's the research saying about what the Brexit Party could do, the impact they could have in this election?
So there's lots of things. There's lots of answers.
Lots in there.
There's lots of answers.
You've got 1 minute.
I suppose, So one of the first things to say is that the Brexit Party did really well in the European Parliament elections very recently, and of course it was extraordinary. There's a party that hadn't come from nowhere in a sense, but I don't think that's true. But it looked like it hadn't come from just came from nowhere, and did very well in the European Parliament elections. And then subsequent to that, there's been a drop off in support for the Brexit Party. Obviously, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister after those elections and then, secured his deal even since. And so we've seen a drop-off in the polls. But the Brexit Party is still currently polling around the level of UKIP's highest polling share in the 2015 election. And so you sort of go back in time and say, OK, well, let's look at UKIP support. So what we've done is we've looked at UKIP voters in the European Parliament elections in 2014, Brexit Party voters in the European Parliament elections in the 2019 EP elections. And we've sort of said, well, how similar are these people? Do they have the same kinds of concerns? And actually, we can trace respondents in our surveys in the British election study of actually people that voted in both elections. And we can see that there's this very, very, very close correspondence between UKIP voters and Brexit Party voters. Slightly older Brexit Party voters are, and they have greater concerns about Europe, which actually is shared by lots of voters, not just Brexit Party voters. But they're very some very striking similarities. And so you can look at UKIP's share in 2015 when they were polling at that kind of level. And say, well, where did they, what kind of impact did UKIP have? And, UKIP had one MP. And, because of the electoral system, it's very difficult for emerging parties to break through. So it's very unlikely, just as UKIP found in 2015, it's very unlikely the Brexit Party is going to, win more seats or win seats. But of course, when they take a proportion of the share of the vote in a constituency, that's a share of a vote that could have gone to another party. And, broadly speaking, UKIP voters were going back to the Tories in 2017. And, the Brexit Party voters are predominantly coming from the Conservative Party. Just like if you kind of then go and say, well, we're not just interested in Brexit Party voters, we're actually interested in Leave voters. It's 2/3 of Conservatives who voted Leave versus 1/3 of Labour voters that voted Leave.
So there's more of them.
So there's more of them. There's more Conservatives who voted Leave. There's more Brexit Party voters who voted Conservative. And so a lot of the damage is to the Conservative vote, but whether this plays out badly for Labour in terms of seats. So if the Brexit Party voters go back to the Tories in the 2019 general election, that would be bad for Labour in terms of seats if the Tories then take the seats because they've got a higher share there and, and so on. And of course, the big question is how many Labour Leave voters have been tempted by the Brexit Party, might be tempted by the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson. But I think, one of the confusing things is because there's lots of Labour Leave constituencies, it's like the assumption is, well, you've got more Labour Leave voters
They're
there.
all Leavers, or most of them are.
But actually the distribution is very similar across the country. So essentially, you've got an electoral threat there from the Brexit Party. But there's also this recognition that just because, in a European Parliament election, it's, makes more sense to vote for minor parties under a different electoral system, are those Brexit Party voters going to look at the choice? They're going to look at Boris Johnson, they're going to look at Nigel Farage. As I said, Nigel Farage is still kind of adjusting what he's, making decisions about his campaign. They're very similarly popular amongst Brexit Party voters. So in a sense, Nigel Farage is a threat to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson's a threat to Nigel Farage. And that wasn't the case in prior elections.
Which is interesting because we're talking here about a party that's less than a year old, and it's amazing that the only, like you said, the only bit of election data we have to go on was only a few months ago.
Right.
But so much has changed in that few months.
Yeah, exactly.
In that not only is Boris is more popular than Theresa May amongst those voters.
Yes.
On top of that, he now has a deal,
right.
And the promise is, if you vote for me, you'll have Brexit in a few weeks, which is different to what the offer was in the European elections when you had Theresa May and a different deal, and the prospect of getting it through wasn't on the horizon.
Exactly. And also very different to 2015.
Yeah.
When, so what if you look at the UKIP vote, you sort of see the UKIP vote for sending a very strong signal, right? We really care about Europe, we really care about leaving the EU, and we really care about immigration. And the Conservative Party adjusting its position and promising a referendum, and then that referendum being delivered. And then subsequently in the 2017 election, you see the UKIP vote really collapse because essentially the Tory party has given you what you pretty much wanted, maybe not exactly, but much closer. And But then the Brexit Party emerges again when that isn't delivered. So if those Brexit Party voters see that actually I'm going to get Brexit with the Tories, I'm probably not going to get Brexit with a Brexit Party vote because that party's not going to be in power to do anything about it, then, you know, I might as well vote for the Conservatives. And that's certainly what Boris Johnson is really counting on, is that, you know, that's going to be enough.
Yeah, and it's what Nigel Farage is trying so hard to cut through and say this isn't Brexit at all, because that's his sort of key selling point, isn't it? It's suggesting that what Boris Johnson is offering isn't Brexit. I also want to ask you about the Lib Dems. There's been a lot of talk about the Lib Dems coming in and sort of doing what the Brexit Party are doing to the Tories, but to Labour. Loads of constituencies across the country that there'll be sort of Remain voters who will look at Labour and think, I think I'm sort of more interested in voting on the Lib Dems because they've got a stronger Brexit position when it comes to remaining in the EU. But could they also impact the Tories as well? Could there be loads of Remain Tory voters who look at the current position and say, maybe I think I like the look of the Lib Dems? Do you think they could play a big role over the next 5 years?
I think the Remain Conservatives are fascinating. And, you know, as I say, and I think, you know, the danger with Brexit is that we all fall into these kind of just dichotomies, you know, with like, oh, you're a Leave voter, you're a Remain voter, and you kind of fulfil these kind of, you know, caricatures, and we think Conservatives are Leave supporting, but, you know, roughly a third of Conservatives supported Remain. And so, you know, they were less in favour of Boris Johnson than Leave Conservative voters, and they're more in favour of Theresa May's position, stuck with Theresa May under her deal. And so, you know, it's a very interesting question whether or not, you know, there are sort of the flip side of what we're talking about. There are more Remain Labour voters, but there are still, so there's more of them, but there's still a proportion of Conservative Remain voters who might be tempted by either the Liberal Democrats or the alliance, you know, the pact that's between the Remain supporting parties. But then there's a question, you know, where does this play out in seats? And so, you know, where are the Liberal Democrats potentially competing? They're competing primarily in Conservative Liberal Democrat seats. And so, you know, yes, the Liberal Democrats would like to take seats away from the Labour Party, but there's not as many of those in the Liberal Democrat targets. There's some SNP seats as well in Scotland. But primarily, you've got Liberal Democrats competing with Conservative constituencies. And yet, in a decent proportion of those, the Leave vote is quite high. So you're sort of looking at which of those constituencies are Conservative power constituencies, the Liberal Democrats used to do really well in them, and there's a large enough Remain vote in those constituencies that could go back to the Liberal Democrats. But certainly the Liberal Democrats, you know, like 2017 was really, really striking for one really key thing. Well, lots of key things, but one in particular, and that was, it was just this election that confounded everything we thought was going on in British politics, because the two major parties did so well. In terms of they gobbled up, you know, the lion's
share.
After
2015, we thought it's the start of the splinter away from the two.
Exactly.
And then it went back.
In 2 years.
Yeah. And it went back to a time like the 80s or even before that, when it was just a two-party system. Yeah,
exactly.
Could it now go the other way?
It could go the other way. And so you had, you know, for, like you were saying, you know, since the 70s, you got this kind of fragmentation. So you get more voters moving away from the two major parties. And that looked like it peaked in 2015. Certainly the smaller parties, obviously wasn't the Liberal Democrats' year. But 2017, just in this time, you know, just when you thought you kind of understood everything, you know, boom, you get this really massive vote share for the two major parties. But what that means is if people are now moving away from the two major parties, it's the time for the Lib Dems again. And so you've seen their polling, you know, increase very substantially from 2017. And the Greens are doing slightly better, and, you know, the other, the nationalist parties also. And so this really could be should be much better for the Liberal Democrats. And they've had not just Brexit with their Remain position to try to get Remain voters, but they're also recovering from that kind of damage done to them by going into coalition with the Tories.
So, I mean, it's feasible that for a vote share, not on a constituency level, that we could get to a point where the Brexit Party do quite well in terms of a vote share, the Lib Dems do quite well in terms of a vote share, and we could have a completely different look to what we had in 2017.
Yeah, but in seats, you might get a large seat share by the two major parties.
So that will stay the same. That's fascinating.
Or higher.
Thank you so much, Jane. We really appreciate it. We're going to see you on our TV screens throughout the ITV news coverage of this election, but also on election night. You're
absolutely
the stars. So you'll be in the studio with Tom and the rest of the team.
During which you'll have to say whether you like Dan or I more.
We've got 5 weeks. And if you can, because we asked Robert to do this, to plug the podcast, but he forgot to. If you could just mention calling Peston in like every interview you do between now and the election, that would be great.
All right, I'll have like one of those games where one of my friends gets like a gin and tonic or something every time I say calling Peston.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if you can mention it in the book.
Oh, too late.
That's too late for that.
But if you can mention the book in calling Peston, then maybe we can come to some arrangement.
That's staying in the edit. Thank you very much.